Ethiopic or Githis is one of the oldest languages, if not the oldest language we have in the world. Ethiopia was the first Christian kingdom in the world. Researchers at Oxford University confirmed what Ethiopian monks have guarded for 15 centuries. The oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts on earth never left their mountain monastery. What those monks have been guarding, and what some of them were recently ordered to destroy, turns out to be something the rest of the Christian world was never meant to see. Deep inside a monastery carved into the cliffs of northern Ethiopia, a handful of monks made a decision. They had held a manuscript for generations. They had been told, explicitly, that it should never leave their walls. Some accounts suggest they were told to go further than that, to remove it from existence entirely. They didn't. Instead, they released it. And the page they released mentions Jesus by name. It describes him in ways that don't match anything in the Bible most of the world reads. And it raises a question, as some biblical scholars are still struggling to answer. Was this information suppressed on purpose? Or did someone simply decide that the world wasn't ready? That decision, made centuries ago in the highlands of East Africa, is now unraveling in real time. The full story is far stranger than that question suggests. To understand what's happening now, you need to understand where it's been hiding. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth. It traces its roots to the 4th century when King Ezana of the ancient kingdom of Aksum converted to Christianity, guided by a Syrian missionary named Frumentius, making Aksum one of the first nations in human history to adopt the faith as a state religion. That was around 330 CE. The Roman Empire wouldn't follow for another 50 years. It did because Ethiopia received Christianity so early, and because its highland geography effectively isolated it from the doctrinal disputes that reshaped Christianity in Europe and the Middle East. The Ethiopian church developed along its own track. It made its own decisions about which texts were sacred. It translated those texts into Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that survives today only in liturgical use, the way Latin once functioned in the Catholic Church. And the canon the Ethiopian church settled on is unlike any other in Christianity. While the Protestant Bible contains 66 books and the Catholic Bible 73, Ibaisiwen Tab, the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, contains 81, the largest biblical canon in all of traditional Christendom. Those extra books aren't fringe documents. They include the Book of Enoch, a text that describes fallen angels sharing forbidden knowledge with humanity. They include the Book of Jubilees, which rewrites the timeline of Genesis in ways that contradict the version most of the world uses. They include the Meshach Hakkadon, the Book of the Covenant, which contains accounts of the resurrection and the post-resurrection teachings of Jesus that simply do not appear in Western scripture. Some of these texts were burned in Rome, some were deliberately removed from circulation. Ethiopia kept them, and nobody outside those monasteries knew the full extent of what had been preserved. Now, picture where this preservation happened. The Abba Garima Monastery sits on a cliff face in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, east of the city of Adwa, at an elevation where the air is thin and the stone is ancient. To reach it, you climb a winding path cut into the rock. The walls of the monastery are thick, old enough to hold silence. Inside, the light falls in pale shafts through small windows. The smell is incense and dust and something older than both. Even manuscripts are stored in leather cases, stitched from thick brown hide, worn smooth by the hands of priests across centuries. The parchment inside is vellum, prepared animal skin, and some of it has gone brittle at the edges, curling slightly inward, as though it still wants to close. It was here, in the early 1950s, that a British art historian named Beatrice Plain became the first Westerner to document what the monks possessed. Because women are not permitted inside the monastery, the monks carried these manuscripts outside for her to examine. She wrote afterward that the illuminated heading struck her as Syrian in style. Ancient, sophisticated, far older than anyone had assumed. She had no idea what the radiocarbon tests would eventually prove. For weeks after her visit, the manuscripts stayed exactly where they had always been. Then the science caught up. In the early 2000s, near the Ethiopian Heritage Fund, a British charity established in 2005 to protect Ethiopia's objects, sent a team of specialists to the Abba Garima Monastery. Conservators. Lester Capon and Mark Winstanley made the climb in 2006 with equipment strapped to their backs, set up a workspace in the monastery courtyard, and began the delicate work of unbinding and stabilizing what are now known as the Garima Gospels. What they found was extraordinary. The manuscripts, 2 volumes, each containing roughly 400 pages of hand-copied text in Jahez, were not merely old. They were, by the measurements of radiocarbon analysis conducted at Oxford University, potentially the oldest complete illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence. Oxford dated the parchment to somewhere between 330 and 650 CE. The previously acknowledged oldest illustrated Christian manuscript, the Rabila Gospels from Syria, dates to 586 CE. The Garima Gospels may be 2 centuries older than that, yet Judith Mackenzie of Oxford University and Francis Watson of Durham University later published a comprehensive scholarly study of the manuscripts, placing them firmly within the late antique Mediterranean world, yet entirely, distinctly Ethiopian. While the analysis included something even the monks found surprising, the text represented what scholar Ralkos Zermond classified as an early Byzantine textual tradition, a version of the Gospels that predates the later revisions that shaped every Bible in the Western world. In other words, the Garima Gospels may not just be old, they may be closer to the original text than anything the Western Church produced. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the textbooks. But the monks weren't done. The Garima Gospels are remarkable for what they are. What we're about to get into is remarkable for what they contain, and what has been kept alongside them. The Book of Enoch is one of the most consequential texts in religious history. It's quoted directly and indirectly in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude references it almost verbatim. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen treated it as authoritative. The Dead Sea Scrolls, he'd discovered in 1947 in the caves above Qumran, contained fragments of it in Hebrew and Aramaic. But for centuries, the Western world believed the complete text had been lost. It had not been lost. It had never left Ethiopia. Ethiopian monks had preserved the Book of Enoch in its entirety in Gehis, copied and recopied by hand across centuries. It was the Scottish explorer James Bruce who brought 3 copies of the complete Ethiopian manuscript to Europe in 1773. And even then, most Western theologians dismissed it as a medieval fabrication. It took the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove that the Ethiopian tradition had been protecting the genuine article all along. The question that remains is why the rest of Christianity abandoned it. The answer points directly to what makes this story uncomfortable. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, taught humanity forbidden arts. He and whose offspring became the source of violence and corruption in the world. It also describes the coming of a figure called the Son of Man, a divine judge who will arrive at the end of days. Early Christians understood this as a direct reference to Jesus. The text used language about this figure that the later church found dangerous. It suggested knowledge, power, and cosmic authority that existed before any institutional structure, before any hierarchy, before any church. That is where the problem lived. The Enoch tradition didn't need a priest. It didn't need an institution. It described a direct relationship between humanity and the divine that bypassed every structure the church was building. To understand why this matters, we need to step back 17 centuries. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, just years after King Azana converted Ethiopia to Christianity, Roman Emperor Constantine convened bishops from across the empire to settle doctrinal disputes. And the question of which texts were authoritative was central to those discussions. Over the following decades, texts that survived would define Christianity for 1 billion people. Texts that didn't survive would be lost, or would survive only where Rome's authority could not reach. Ethiopia was one of those places. There's a word the monks used for the texts they preserved, netzenet. It means freedom. They were not hiding these texts. They were keeping them safe. If you're finding this story worth exploring further, a like on this video genuinely helps this channel keep investigating these mysteries. Now we get to the thing in the title. The page that, according to accounts that have not been independently verified through peer-reviewed publications, was ordered destroyed. The Meshafa Kidon, or Book of the Covenant, is one of the texts unique to the Ethiopian canon. It belongs to a category of writings called the Books of Church Order, 8 additional texts included in the Ethiopian New Testament that have no parallel in Western Christianity. The Meshafa Kidon contains, among other things, an account of the post-resurrection period, the weeks following the empty tomb, that goes further than any canonical gospel in describing what Jesus reportedly taught during that time. In the version preserved by Ethiopian monks, Jesus does not simply appear, he blesses disciples and ascend. He stays, he teaches, he addresses questions that the canonical Gospels leave unanswered. He describes the nature of the divine. He warns explicitly about what will happen to those teachings once they pass through institutional hands. That warning, which the monks say was the reason certain church authorities wanted the page suppressed, is what makes this particular passage so volatile. Yet the exact wording has not been released in a certified academic translation. What has been reported, through monks who spoke to journalists and independent scholars beginning in late 2024, is that the passage contains a description of Jesus cautioning his followers that his teachings would be narrow, edited, and selectively preserved by those who came after. That the version of his words reaching future generations would be shaped not only by faith, but by power. Now this is where the story splits. One path leads to a conventional explanation. The other leads somewhere far more uncomfortable. The conventional explanation, this type of post-resurrection teaching narrative, was common in early Christianity. There were dozens of texts, many of them found among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1945, that described extended conversations between the risen Jesus and his disciples. Most were excluded from the canon, not because they were dangerous, but because canon formation, the process of deciding which books made it into the Bible, was a slow, uneven, and often politically influenced process. The Meshach Hakadan may simply represent a tradition that survived in one corner of the world while being forgotten elsewhere. The Uncomfortable Path says something different. It says the passage was ordered destroyed specifically because of that warning. Yet because an institution doesn't easily survive a sacred text, suggesting that the institution itself was anticipated and cautioned against by the figure it claims to represent, the monks kept it anyway. The story of what Ethiopian monks will protect and what they'll risk to protect it became devastatingly concrete in November 2020. When war came to the Tigray region of Ethiopia, the beginning of what would become one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century, killing an estimated 600,000 people between 2020 and 2022, Father Gebre Tzadok, one of the resident monks at the Abagarima monastery, made a decision that echoed across 15 centuries. Under the cover of darkness, he took the Garima Gospels out of the monastery for the first time in recorded history. He carried them in their leather cases down the monastery's winding stone steps, and into the night he hid them. He didn't tell anyone where. 2 weeks later, the Eritrean forces reached the monastery. They took what they could: mobile phones, livestock, grain stores, farming equipment. What they couldn't take, they destroyed. For the next 2 years, soldiers used Abagarima as a military base. In the final days before a peace agreement was signed, 113 civilians were executed nearby by retreating forces. Their bodies were left where they fell. The Garima Gospels survived, hidden, waiting. When Father Gebre Tzadok returned the manuscripts after the peace agreement, he described the experience in terms that resonate beyond the military and political context. He said the texts had been hidden before, possibly for centuries during previous invasions, rediscovered later by chance. He said that the monastery had always understood that knowledge, to survive, sometimes has to disappear for a while. The data was clear. The implications were anything but. Because if texts have been hidden and rediscovered before, if some of what Ethiopia preserved was already a second or third survival, then the question isn't only what was saved. The question is, what was lost between the survivals? What pages didn't make it through the last war or the one before that? And whether any of those pages contained information that would have changed everything about what the world believes. Let's step back from the individual manuscripts for a moment. Well, let's look at the shape of what Ethiopia represents in the larger story of religious history. Every tradition that transmitted Christian texts made choices. The choice about which texts were authoritative. The choice about which descriptions of Jesus were theologically useful. The choice, ultimately, about which Jesus the world would come to know. Those choices happened across centuries, in councils and synods, in Nicaea, in Carthage, in Laodicea, mostly in the Roman world, mostly filtered through Roman political and cultural assumptions. The texts that survive that process tell a coherent story. They support a specific understanding of authority, of salvation, of the relationship between the human and the divine. Ethiopia made different choices, and the texts that survive those different choices tell a more complicated story. Some scholars, including specialists in what's called the Second Temple Jewish tradition, the world Jesus actually inhabited, argue that the Ethiopian canon preserves something genuinely older than what Rome produced. Not a fabrication, not a medieval invention, but an earlier layer of Christianity, one in which the boundaries between the canonical and the apocryphal, between the accepted and the forbidden, hadn't yet been drawn. They point to the Enoch tradition and to early Jewish Christianity, which understood the divine in ways that would later be declared heretical. They point to the sheer quantity of material that Ethiopian monks preserved while the rest of the world was burning it. One controversial theory suggests that the page the monks were ordered to destroy contains something even more specific, a description of Jesus explicitly critiquing the mechanism of religious authority, the priesthood itself. It's the concept of a human institution mediating between the divine and the individual, if that reading is accurate. It places a deeply anti-institutional statement at the heart of the world's most powerful institution. That's not just theologically awkward. It's existentially threatening to any organization that has spent 2,000 years building legitimacy on the claim that it represents Jesus accurately. Of course, there are simpler explanations, where the passage may have been excluded for the same reason hundreds of early Christian texts were excluded. Because the process of canon formation was chaotic, incomplete, and inconsistent, not because anyone was running a cover-up. The Ethiopian texts are not secret in any practical sense. Scholars have known they existed for decades. The Book of Enoch was published in English translation in 1821. The Meshach Hakadim has been available in academic circles for years. Yet, but the specific page, the specific passage describing that warning, remains untranslated in any peer-reviewed publication. The monks have not released the full text, and that restraint, after everything they risked to preserve it, raises a question that keeps quiet scholars uncomfortable at night. If it's not dangerous, why wait? Somewhere in northern Ethiopia, in a monastery that survived a war, the Jerima Gospels have returned to their leather cases. The pages are still brittle. The ink is still legible. The Ge'ez script flows across the vellum the way it has for 1,500 years, indifferent to everything that has happened around it. Those manuscripts have outlasted the kingdom that produced them. They outlasted the medieval invasions, the Italian colonizers, the Civil War. They were hidden in a cave, possibly for centuries, and rediscovered. They were carried down stone steps under cover of darkness, and brought back again when the shooting stopped. It is they survived because a series of men, monks who gave their lives to this specific task, decided that their preservation mattered more than their own safety. This is the moment where the story becomes about something larger than manuscripts. We live in a period of profound institutional distrust, declining faith in organized religion, questions about what was selected, what was omitted, what was shaped by the people in power rather than the people who were supposed to be served by that power. Yet those questions aren't new, but they're louder now than they've been in generations. And into that environment, the Ethiopian tradition places an ancient, inconvenient idea that the original version of the story was bigger than what survived. That what most of the world calls the Bible is a selection, a preserved and protected selection, but a selection nonetheless. That somewhere in the highlands of a country that most of the world overlooked, the monks were keeping something alive that the rest of the world had been told to forget. The page they were ordered to destroy, the warning they were told to silence. They kept it. They always kept it. And now it is circulating, partially, guardedly, a fragment at a time, into a world that is perhaps finally ready to sit with what it says. Not because it destroys faith. The monks who preserved it are among the most devout Christians alive. But because it complicates faith in ways that make it more honest, more human, more like the actual story of what it means to encounter the divine through the filter of history, politics, survival, and human hands. The text has weight. That weight has been carried across 15 centuries by people who believed the burden was worth bearing. Now it belongs to all of us. So here is the question that remains. If the monks of Abagarima were ordered to destroy a specific passage, a page describing Jesus warning his followers about what would happen to his teachings, who gave that order? And when? Was it a recent instruction from within the Ethiopian Orthodox hierarchy itself? An institution that has its own reasons for managing which parts of its canon become internationally visible? Or was the order older, a directive that traveled across centuries, surviving an internal tradition? Are you reminding each generation of monks that this particular passage was not for the world outside the walls? Or is it possible that the monks were never ordered to destroy anything at all, and that what they are releasing now isn't a defiant act of resistance, but a deliberate and carefully timed disclosure? A decision made not under pressure, but with extraordinary patience. The belief that knowledge has weight, and that you only release it when the one receiving it can bear to hold it. Ethan, if this story changes how you see the history of what you've been handed as truths, share it with someone who needs to hear it. One final thought. The monks say some knowledge was preserved not by being announced, but by being hidden long enough that the wrong people stopped looking. Maybe that time is over.